we actually just get the good evening, everyone, and welcome. Thank you so much for joining, as always. So we start the new series after the break of this Lahavah, and I wanted to use this slot. I was requested to use this slot for series of mini series in which we'd look at various common and regular mitzvahs and try and understand these mitzvahs both from a halachic perspective and also achieve some insight into the meaning behind the mitzvah, with a particular slant of looking at the halachas from the perspective of ladies and how halacha applies to women, to ladies doing these mitzvahs. So that's the format of perhaps the next few weeks, and we'll see how that goes. I'm open, by the way, to suggestions of other mitzvahs to look at. So we're going to be starting looking at the mitzvah of Havdalah, a very beautiful mitzvah, and with a lot to say about it, both technically how it works and what the halachas are, conceptually understanding where it comes from, and trying to explore some of the ideas behind it. So that's the first mitzvah that we'll spend a few weeks looking at. And after that, I'm open to suggestions about other mitzvahs that we can discuss. I've also done the normal format of muting everyone, but please feel free to unmute yourselves if you wish to ask any questions. Alternatively, you can use the chat function to ask questions. So, the mitzvah of Havdalah, where does this mitzvah come from? What does it include? What's it all about? So, the starting point is really a pasuk in the Torah, and the pasuk tells us, Zocher es yom haShabbos lekadsho. Remember the day of Shabbos to lekadsho, to keep it holy, to sanctify it. The Aseres HaDibros, the Ten Commandments, and then it carries on. Sheishes Yomim Tavod, Zoslis K'Machtecha. For 6 days we do our work, but Yom HaShvi Shabbos, the 7th day, is Shabbos LaHashem Elokecha. It's Shabbos which we dedicate to Hashem. Now, even though this comes from the Ten Commandments, famously, there are two forms of how this pasuk is written. Once in the transcription of the Ten Commandments in Sefer Shemos, in Parshas Yisro, and the second time when Moshe repeats the Ten Commandments and summarizes them in Sefer Dvarim in Parshas Veschanan. In Shemos, Moshe says, Zocher es yom haShabbos lekadsho, remember the day of Shabbos to sanctify it. In Sefer Dvarim, he says, Shomer es yom haShabbos, God Shabbos. And for now, we're not going to go into this discrepancy. Chazal understands that both are true, that both were said in some form of combination. Moshe in Sefer Dvarim reflects one way of having heard the words of Hashem. In Sefer Shemos reflects the other one. Hashem can convey more than one idea in one phrase, in one lesson. He said both in one go, and we hear it in different ways. What does Shomer, guard the day of Shabbos, mean? Well, it means protect it, keep that which we need to keep, i.e. don't break it, referring to the famous negative prohibitions of Shabbos. But what does Zocher es yom haShabbos lekadsho mean? Remember the day of Shabbos. So actually I spoke about this in Shul in my Havdala Halacha on Friday night. Chazal understand the word Zocher, remember, not just to mean cognitive memory, memory in our head, to remember, but verbal memory, to mention it. In fact, in Old English, this is probably why we translate it as remember. In Old English, people sometimes, when they say remember, actually mean to mention. They might say, remember me to someone. Perhaps you've heard people use that turn of phrase, because Zocher, and in Old English, the translation of remember, meant to mention it. So Chazal understands in general, when the Torah tells us lizkar, to remember, it means verbally so. So for example, very famously, in a couple of months' time, we will have Parshas Zocher, when we will verbally remember Amalek by reading about it in the Torah. Similarly, when we remember Yitzias Mitzrayim, the Exodus from Egypt, we do so verbally. Here the Torah says Zocher es yom haShabbos, which means mention the sanctity of Shabbos. And Chazal, the sages, understand that this is achieved by mentioning Shabbos twice. Once at the beginning of Shabbos, which is what we call Kiddush, and once at the conclusion of Shabbos, which is what we call Havdalah. So we mention the uniqueness of Shabbos, one of the 10 commandments, through two methods. Through mentioning it at the start of Shabbos, declaring Shabbos holy, and this is what we refer to as Kiddush, and once at the end of Shabbos, which is what we refer to as Havdalah, by separating, Lahavdil, to separate, saying Shabbos is Kodesh, holy, the weekday is Chol, it's secular, it's mundane, it's not impure or contaminated, but it is Chol, it's the root of the word Chol, secular is linked to Chalal, a vacuum, it's empty of spirituality unless we enthuse it and infuse it with spirituality, and through separation, we declare the uniqueness of Shabbos. Now, as far as Torah law is concerned, this is achieved through Zohar, through a mention of the uniqueness of Shabbos. And therefore, as far as Torah law is concerned, it would be sufficient to mention Shabbos at the beginning of Shabbos, and that would be Kiddush. That would be enough to fulfill the mitzvah of Kiddush. The sages, Chazal, added 2 dimensions to the mitzvah of Kiddush at the start of Shabbos. First of all, they said there's a particular nusach, a particular text. And secondly, they said one should do the mitzvah over wine. One should declare Shabbos holy in the presence of wine. For certain mitzvahs, like Kiddush, and we'll see shortly Havdalah, they added Kiddush wine they added wine, a bracha over wine as a component of the mitzvah. It's very interesting which mitzvahs they chose to add wine to and which they didn't. So no one expects that when we blow the shofar, we should also drink a cup of wine with it. Or when we shake lulav and esrog, we should also drink a cup of wine with it. However, when we make Kiddush, they added to the mitzvah wine, perhaps because the mitzvah of Kiddush is particularly associated with elevating the physical, and therefore wine was added to it. It's interesting, if we look at the totality of mitzvahs that we add wine to a bris milah, to a wedding ceremony, to Kiddush and Havdalah, and to benching, nowadays benching on a significant or formal meal. And all of these are perhaps associated with elevating the physical, and therefore perhaps this is the common denominator of which mitzvahs we add wine to or grape juice to. Either way, the mitzvah of Kiddush, as far as Torah law is concerned, can be fulfilled just by Zochar es Yom HaShabbos, by mentioning the sanctity of Shabbos. Perhaps even just by saying Shabbat Shalom or Good Shabbos, one's already fulfilled the mitzvah of Kiddush, as far as Torah law is concerned. Nonetheless, rabbinically, they said the way to fulfill this mitzvah is by saying what we call Kiddush, not just by declaring Shabbos holy, but by saying a certain text, the text of Kiddush, and doing so over wine. Our subject, however, is not Kiddush, but Havdalah, because Havdalah is the twin sister of Kiddush. Havdalah is also Zochar es Yom HaShabbos Kacho, mentioning the uniqueness and the sanctity of Shabbos. Probably min HaTorah, probably this is how the sages understood the pasuk, that as far as Torah law is concerned, one should mention at the departure of Shabbos the sanctity of the departed Shabbos, which is what we now know as Havdalah, though it's possible that this is in totality a rabbinic obligation. Either way, as far as the core halacha would be concerned, the mitzvah of Havdalah, of mentioning the structure, the sanctity of Shabbos, could also be fulfilled by merely saying, declaring that now is weekday, now is no longer Shabbos, and that would be enough to fulfill the obligation. Nonetheless, rabbinically, once again, they added the obligation of doing it over wine with a particular full text. And therefore, again, as far as core halacha would be concerned, one has fulfilled the mitzvah of Havdalah just by mentioning that this is no longer Shabbos, perhaps even by saying Shavua Tov or the like. Nonetheless, there is a rabbinic obligation to fulfill Havdalah, the mitzvah of declaring the sanctity of Shabbos as being over, as being departed, through a particular text, which is what we call the text of Havdalah, and doing so over wine. Now, either in the ends of this week or probably next week, we will look in more detail at how this developed, how the addition of doing it over wine historically unfolded, because the truth is we also say Havdalah not over wine. And this is the familiar declaration that for some reason, before making the formal Havdalah, we need to exit Shabbos mode. We can do so by just saying, Baruch HaMavdil Ben Kodesh L'Chol, and blessed is he who distinguishes, separates between the holy Shabbos and the secular weekday. And that's enough to have done a minimal Havdalah. Similarly, in the text of Mariv on Motzi Shabbos, we say a short Havdalah in the fourth bracha of the Amidah, Atachonein La'odom Das, the bracha that speaks about wisdom and human ingenuity. And in that bracha, we declare the cessation of Shabbos. So we still do a type of Havdalah which isn't over wine. And we'll need to understand what this double structure of Havdalah is. Why is it that we do Havdalah both over wine as the more formal Havdalah, and we also do the more minimalistic Havdalah not done over wine? So this is the structure of Havdalah. Now, Havdalah isn't only a declaration of cessation of Shabbos, fulfilling the mitzvah of declaring the uniqueness of Shabbos, Zocher es Yom HaShabbos L'Kadsho. It also ushers Shabbos out, such that until one has made Havdalah, one shouldn't engage in work. One's still in Shabbos mode, using the halachic concept of Tosefes Shabbos, the continuation or the addition to Shabbos, that even though Shabbos technically starts with sunset on Friday and finishes with nightfall on Shabbos, nonetheless we start Shabbos a little early. We have the ability to usher Shabbos in a little early, and Shabbos lingers or remains after nightfall until we declare Shabbos over. So Havdalah plays a double role. It both is the mitzvah of declaring the uniqueness of Shabbos, and it also is an allower, an enabler. Through saying Havdalah, whether the full text of Havdalah over wine or the minimal text of Havdalah in Mariv, or through just saying the words Baruch HaMavdil Ben Kodesh L'Chol, that itself ushers Shabbos out. And therefore Havdalah does two things. It's a mitzvah of declaring Shabbos holy, and also an usherer out of Shabbos, an enabler of something to happen. If one wants to use a very rough parable, if one thinks, for example, about shechita, the ritual slaughter of animals, so there's no obligation particularly to do shechita, to go and slaughter. However, if we want to have kosher meat, we need to do shechita. So shechita is just an enabler, if you like. It's a mitzvah to do this enabler in order to have kosher meat, but fundamentally it's an allower, it's a matir. It allows us to do something. Havdalah has that aspect to it. It is a necessary matir to cause heter, to cause something to be mutter, to usher out Shabbos, to allow us to do work on Motzi Shabbos. And in addition, it's a mitzvah of declaring the sanctity of Shabbos, Zocher es Yom HaShabbos L'Kadsho. The exact relationship between these two elements of it being an allower and enabler on the one hand, and on the other hand, a mitzvah of declaring Shabbos, the sanctity of Shabbos is a more complicated discussion, which we may or may not go into, but Shabbos has both elements to it. Can one do a malacha before Havdalah if you say Baruch HaMavdil Ben Kodesh L'Chol? The answer is yes, because by doing the minimum declaration of Shabbos being out, one has now ushered Shabbos out, and therefore we no longer need to keep Shabbos. One can break Shabbos, as it were. One can do things forbidden on Shabbos, because we've already declared Shabbos out. Nonetheless, we still haven't done the fuller mitzvah of Havdalah, as rabbinically decreed, to use the full formula and do so over wine. And therefore, until that has happened, one shouldn't eat and engage in eating anything. One should wait and do the mitzvah before one eats. However, one has already escorted Shabbos out by declaring Baruch HaMavdil, and therefore that would be enough to now break Shabbos, to no longer keep the halachas of Shabbos. So in the context of an overview of trying to understand everything we do on Motzi Shabbos, what we have discussed so far is a brief declaration of Shabbos being out, whether just by saying the formula Baruch HaMavdil, or if one davens Mariv by saying the brief Havdalah text in the Amidah of Mariv. And then there's the full fulfillment of the mitzvah of Havdalah, which is Borei Pri HaGofen, i.e. over grape juice or wine, plus the text of Havdalah, which is the rabbinically decreed way of declaring the separation between the holy and the secular, and that is the full rabbinic mitzvah of Havdalah. Nonetheless, there are additional elements that we are familiar with that we do on a Motzi Shabbos when we make Havdalah, and I just want to briefly mention them so that we have discussed in full the structure of Havdalah, after which we'll begin unpicking in more detail each of these individual components. So what do we do when we say Havdalah? Well, we first start off with introductory psukim. The theme of these psukim are hope, encouragement, happiness, joy, and trust in Hashem. And these are just minhagim, they are custom. There's no halachic requirement to say these psukim. They are minhag, and exactly which psukim one says, different people have different minhagim. Broadly speaking, there are three main versions of the psukim. The Sephardi version of the psukim, who say one lot of psukim, quite a long and lengthy series of psukim. And the second is the Ashkenazi version of psukim, split into two. Basically, both Ashkenazi minhagim are very similar, but Western Ashkenazim from the Yekish group of people, German and French and Dutch Jews, say one variant of psukim, and Eastern European Ashkenazim say another variant of psukim. They're pretty similar, but with a couple of additional psukim. But the theme, whether for Western European Jews, Eastern European Jews, or Sephardim, is the idea of trust in Hashem and encouragement. And the concept behind this is obvious, that as we leave Shabbos, we feel a sense of loss. And one can feel a little low on Motzi Shabbos. The Gemara describes this as the loss of the neshama yisera, the extra soul, extra spirituality that one has on Shabbos. And as Shabbos departs, one feels a sense of loss, an awareness of the departure of the spirituality. We'll see later that this is a reason for the Somim also. And therefore the minhag is that we say these words of encouragement and simcha, that we experience joy and celebration, words from the Megillah, the celebration of Purim. We also declare our faith in Hashem. Hashem is the God of my salvation. I will trust and I won't be afraid, because I'm about to enter the working week. Not just spiritually am I feeling the loss of my neshama yosera, but psychologically I'm missing Shabbos. I'm aware that I'm now going to enter the working week. Our responsibility in the working week is sheishes yomim tavod. We have to work. We have to earn our livelihood. We have to earn our parnasa. We have to engage in supporting ourselves. When we do so, we put maximum effort into it. And therefore, it's appropriate for us to remind ourselves that ultimately, even though we are required and expected to work, we are still, of course, in the hands of Hashem. Hinei kel yeshuasi, we recognize that He is the one that looks after us. Evtach v'lo efchad, I'm never going to have perfect faith in HaKadosh Baruch Hu. So this is one component of Havdalah, the pesukim at the beginning that we say as words of encouragement to ourselves, and it is a minhag. The second element of Havdalah is the bracha borei pri hagofen. As we already discussed, rabbinically, they added wine or grape juice to Havdalah, like Kiddush, as a way of adding significance and chashivas and importance to the mitzvahs. That's the second bracha we make. The third bracha we make is besomim, on spices, which the Gemara teaches us, and we will look at this in more detail, is due to the loss of the neshama yisera, the extra additional spirituality that we had. And then we make a bracha of borei ma'orei ha'esh, a bracha over fire, which again is an addition to Havdalah, which we will look at in more detail. Why we do this on Motzi Shabbos, what are the halachas of this, and finally we say the core text of Havdalah, which is the bracha of Hamavdil, ben kodesh l'chol, ben or l'choshech, between light and dark, between the 6 days of work and Shabbos itself. This is the core Havdalah. This is Zachor Yom Shabbos HaKadsho, distinguishing, separating between the holiness of Shabbos and the secular nature of the weekday, and therefore in so doing, in recognizing this, fulfilling the obligation of Zochar es Yom Shabbos l'Kadsho. So that's the broad structure of Havdalah. Now, the detailed look at this involves many halachas, and also a lot of machshava and insight into trying to understand in depth the idea behind all of these. So, for example, we mentioned the basomim, the spices, and there's a lot to say. Which sorts of spices are suitable, which ones aren't, what happens if one doesn't have access to them. Similarly, me'orei ha'esh, why do we make this bracha on fire? What's the text of this bracha? What's the meaning of this bracha? Which sort of fires can we use or can't we use for it? So there's a lot to discuss in detail of the fulfillment of the mitzvah. And in addition, as I said already, what are ladies' relationships to this mitzvah? If a lady makes Havdalah, what parts of the mitzvah does she or does she not do in fulfilling the mitzvah? How do we apply this to ladies? So this is what we're going to look at in more depth over the next few weeks. But what I want to start off with is looking at a very beautiful idea, looking at the bracha of Borei Me'orei Ha'esh, the bracha that is said over fire on Havdalah. Now I'm going out of order over here because this is the third blessing of 4 said when we make Havdalah. Because as we already discussed, the first bracha we make is Borei Ha'gofen, the second is Basomim, the third is the bracha on fire, and the fourth is the bracha on Hamavdil, is the core Havdalah itself. Nonetheless, I want to start off talking about Borei Me'orei Ha'esh out of order. Both because, since this year is somewhat of an introduction, the timing works out such that it makes sense to talk about this bracha now, and then next week to look at some of the other brachas. And secondly, because it's absolutely fascinating and eye-opening and illuminating, quite literally, to look at the concepts behind this bracha. There's very, very beautiful ideas about why we make this bracha at this particular time. So, there are a number of halachic sources, of midrashic sources, forgive me, that discuss an event that happened right at the dawn of human history. This is a medrash in the Bereshis Rabbah. This is a Gemara in Sanhedrin. It's a Gemara in Psochim, and with slight difference of detail, the Medrash tells the following story. And it says that when Adam Harishon was created, when the first human beings, Adam and Chava, were created, they were created midrashically on a Friday. As we know, various events occurred. They sinned, they were expelled from Gan Eden. But Shabbos was their first normal day, their first day post the 6 days of creation. And as Shabbos finished, it began getting dark, night began falling. And Adam felt helpless. He felt overwhelmed by the darkness. Perhaps he had never experienced it before, didn't know what was going on, or perhaps understood it logically, but also just felt vulnerable and afraid of the dark. And here there's 2 versions as to what happened next. In one version of the Medrash, HaKadosh Baruch Hu, Hashem, provided him with fire in the dark. He sent him a pillar of fire in the dark to make light for him and to guard him. Perhaps like the pillar of fire that the Jewish people experienced when they left Egypt. In the second version of the Medrash, something else happened. Adam began striking rocks, flints, we would say, stones together. And out of these stones came light. At which point Adam made the bracha, Borei Me'orei Ha'esh. Blessed is God, the creator of the lights of fire. And then the Medrash carries on, the Gemara carries on that Shmuel, the Gemara figure, says, one of the Amoraim says, that is the reason why we make Borei Me'orei Ha'esh on Motzi Shabbos, because this was the time of the beginning of the creation of fire. So these are absolutely fascinating sources, and there's so much to unpick in them. First of all, on a very practical level, it's very, very wonderful. What is the bracha of Borei Me'orei Ha'esh? Why are we making this bracha at all? We know that we make many brachas on the hana, the benefit we get from the world. So every time we eat a fruit, we say a bracha birchas hanenin, a bracha on the benefit we get from eating this fruit, bari pri ha'etz, or we have a drink of water, shakol nieh b'vari. These are birchas hanenin. On light, we don't make a bracha every time we switch the light on. So what bracha do we make? We make once a week, thanking Hashem for creating light and fire. What is the nature of this bracha? So there are two schools of thought. The minority opinion, the view of Tosfos, in one particular place, is that this is a birchas hanenin. It's a bracha made on consuming the products of this world. When we consume a fruit, every time we say bari pri, with light, since light is all around us, we don't make it every time we consume it. We make it once a week, and then that covers us for the rest of the week. This is the minority view of Tosfos. The mainstream view, and this is the view we'll go through, is that it is not a birchas hanenin. We don't consume light in the same way as we consume fruit, and therefore we don't make it that sort of bracha on it. It's a generic bracha of praise. We say all sorts of praises for Hashem. We discussed in our last series Tefillah, where we open with praise to God. We also say praise when we see a beautiful scene, a great mountain, a large ocean, when we experience a storm and we see the overwhelming forces of nature, thunder and lightning. And similarly, it's appropriate that we give praise to Hashem for light and fire. And therefore, this is the bracha that we make, Borim or Eish. It's a bracha of praise, birchas hashavach, as opposed to a bracha of consuming, birchas hanenin. Now, it's a fantastic and wonderful idea that we make this bracha on Motzi Shabbos. Because if we look with care at this bracha, we see something fascinating. And the way to pick up on this fascinating idea is by learning together a Mishnah in Brachos. And the Mishnah in Brachos says as follows. The Mishnah brings a debate, a seemingly dry academic debate, between Hillel and Shammai, between the school of Hillel, Beis Hillel, and the school of Shammai. And the school of Shammai says that the appropriate bracha to say is Shebara Ma'or Ha'ish. Thank you, Hashem, for creating the light of fire. So says Shammai. Thank you, Hashem, for having created the light of fire. Beis Hillel argues and says two differences. We don't say in the past tense, Shebora, that he created fire back in the day when the world was created, but we say Bore, he continues to create. Difference number one. Difference number two, we don't say Ma'or Ha'ish, the light of fire, but rather we say Ma'ore Ha'ish, the lights of fire. Why is there this difference between these two versions of the bracha? What are they arguing about? So the Vilna Gaon very beautifully explains that Shammai is picturing this as a bracha going back to God's creation of the force of fire and light when he created the world, or perhaps when he gifted it to Adam, according to that version of the Medrash, that God gave Adam, Hashem gave Adam fire when Adam felt alone and vulnerable in the darkness. And therefore it's in the past tense, we give a bracha to Hashem for having created fire in the singular, the force of fire. However, Hillel disagrees. He says we're not making the bracha in the past, the creation of the world when the force of fire was created. We're making the bracha in the present, Bore, and in the plural, Ma'ore Ha'ish, because there's lots of fire and light all around. Every time we switch on the light, every time we light a match or light a fire, these are fires. We're not thanking for the force of fire and light that was created at creation. We're thanking for the current fires that we are creating now. So Shammai is looking at the fire created by Hashem when we humans were passive. We were just the recipients of the force of fire. Hillel is looking at the bracha of daily light, created by who? Well, by human ingenuity, by our mastery of creation and technology, in which we create light by lighting matches, by rubbing flints together, as per the Medrash, by switching on the light, and recognizing that all that ultimately comes back from Hashem, who's continually to create lights in the plural every time we humans create a fire or switch on a light or a flame. So this is something phenomenal. Hillel says we're giving a brach of praise to Hashem, bechas hashbach to Hashem, not for the creation, the natural force of creation of fire, but for our ability to continually create fires, which we recognize as having been given to us by Hashem. In which case, it makes perfect sense that we say this bracha on a Motzi Shabbos. Shabbos is finished. We now go back to the working week, and we're giving praise to Hashem for our ability to master creation, our ability to master technology, to create energy and warmth and light. And fascinatingly, to this day, fire is the symbol of humanity's mastery of creation. It's still fire that symbolizes industry, electricity, factories, energy, light. Fire is the biggest symbol of the mastery of creation. And therefore, Motzi Shabbos, as the Gemara in Pesachim explains, we now go back to being industrious human beings. We stepped back from all acts of creation, the 39 Malachos on Shabbos. We no longer actively exerted our mastery of creation on Shabbos because we wanted to remind ourselves and recognize of the mastery of Hashem. Now Shabbos is over, we go back to the industry of the week. We remember how Adam and his Motzi Shabbos rubbed these two flint stones together to create his fire, to harness the forces embedded in nature. And we now give praise to Hashem for giving us the gift of us having the dignity of being able to master creation, us having the wisdom and insight and know-how to create technology. And therefore, Borei Merori Ha'esh is the bracha in which we give praise to Hashem, not really in this reading for fire. We give praise to Hashem for the gift of human ingenuity and human mastery of creation and technology. And we recognize in so doing, we're starting the week. It's appropriate for us to now recognize that this ultimately comes from Hashem and to give praise to him for so doing. I just want to mention as an aside, a fascinating idea. Humans were puzzled for millennia about this remarkable ability of humans to create fire. And in the pagan world, they told stories about this. Most famously, the Greeks, ancient Greeks tell a story. And the story they tell is that there was a human called Prometheus, a divine force called Prometheus, who stole the original fire from the Greek head of the gods, Zeus, and was punished for that act. In other words, they are seeing human mastery of creation as somehow being a rebellion against the gods in their pagan worldview. Because the gods are pagan gods, there's a multiplicity of them, they are limited, they're competing with each other because they are finite beings, and they are threatened in this worldview by human creativity, by human ingenuity. And this illuminates a key difference between how we look at things and the alternative view. Because whilst for the Greeks, the gods oppose man having use of fire, for us, it's quite the opposite. HaKadosh Baruch Hu initiates our mastery of creation. On Motzi Shabbos, he says to Adam, Shabbos is now over. The dark is frightening and fearful. You deal with it. You master it. Use your ability to bring light. I said on the first day, the first Sunday in history, Yehi, let there be light. But now, you human being, imitate me. You say, Yehi on your first Yom Rishon, your first Sunday in history, because I want you to be the master of creation. I want you to have this ability to create light. So this is the very beautiful bracha of Borei Merori Ha'esh. It's our celebration of human ability, human mastery of technology, granted to us by HaKadosh Baruch Hu and gifted to us on the first Sunday in creation. This is the bracha of Borei Merori Ha'esh. Now, I now want to talk for a few moments about, practically speaking, how we fulfill this mitzvah. How do we fulfill the mitzvah of Borei Merori Ha'esh? And the answer is that the optimal fulfillment of the mitzvah is through a torch rather than a regular light. And the concept behind this is that if one just uses a single flame, though that technically is a fulfillment, should be a fulfillment of bringing light into the world. Nonetheless, we use multiple flames for so doing this, as per the Gemara, as a way of bringing greater kavod to the mitzvah, and also fulfilling quite literally the ma'orei ha'esh, the multiple light that is available. In addition, we need to be able to benefit from the light when we make the bracha. Some have the minhag of turning electric lights off when they make Havdalah. The mainstream minhag is not to do so, but rather to benefit from the candle in some other way. For example, looking briefly at one's fingers or nails in the light. And this is why people put their fingers forward in order to look at them through the night. And there's various reasons based upon mystical sources and Kabbalah for one using one's fingernails as the way that one sees and benefits from the light. But the truth is one could do anything from a halachic point of view to benefit from the light momentarily, and that way we do the bracha of borei ma'orei ha'esh. The truth is, one could also use a filament light bulb to fulfill this mitzvah, because a filament light bulb also has a flame through the glowing element, and therefore this would be also enough to fulfill the mitzvah. Modern light bulbs are a little different. Modern light bulbs generally don't work through a filament, and therefore they wouldn't be enough for the mitzvah. Modern light bulbs work either with fluorescent or with LED. These aren't flames, and therefore one wouldn't be able to do the mitzvah. However, if one still has an old-fashioned light bulb with a glowing filament, one would be able to fulfill the mitzvah of borei ma'orei ha'esh by so doing. So this is the bracha of this praise to HaKadosh Baruch Hu over the fire, which is fulfilled by using a light or a candle. One of the explanations of this Kabbalistic idea of why we use our nails, why we look at our nails on a Motzi Shabbos, is because of a very strange medrash that says, pre the sin of Adam HaRishon, his flesh was made fully of nail-like material. And after his sin, his flesh turns to regular skin with which we are familiar. And the only part of the body left with nail-like material was our nails. So says the Medrash. And the Kabbalistic sources link in to this Medrash, and they say, rather mysteriously, this is the reason why we look at our fingernails on Motzi Shabbos. What does this all mean? Well, one way of understanding it is that our nails, though growing out of our bodies and part of our bodies, nonetheless feel somewhat detached from us. They aren't as sensitive as skin. They are somehow almost a part of our body which almost feels inorganic. It's harder, it's like almost an external structure. It doesn't have nerve endings as they grow out of our body, and therefore we are able to trim them and cut them off without pain. It's a sort of external sense of ourselves. And the Medrash, by saying that pre the sin of Adam, he was made of nails as opposed to skin, is indicating that he was able to look at himself objectively. He didn't have the same subjective view of the world which colored all his perception of everything he saw. I don't want to go now into too much detail into the sin of Adam and Chava, but the sources tell us that pre the sin, they didn't experience temptation from within themselves. It was something external. In other words, they were able to objectively and dispassionately look at the world and make sensible decisions. We human beings, and Adam and Chava themselves, post the sin, are never able to do that. We always see the world initially through our own lenses, through our own biases, through our own perceptions, our own interests, which color our view of life. But then we always need to step back and say, okay, this is how I'm seeing it subjectively, instinctively, but now I need to attempt to see it objectively. Am I seeing it from the other point of view, the other person's point of view? Am I seeing it from Hashem's point of view, from a spiritual perspective? So we always need to recreate and move back to that more objective view of life. And in a sense, this is a reflection of the struggle we face in life. Whilst Adam and Chava in their pristine form could look at the world objectively and rise above their bias, we need to recognize that we can't. We are made of skin. We are no longer made of nails. We are sensitive to everything we experience, but we have to attempt to try and rise above our own self-interests, our own bias, our own perspectives, and try and look at things from other vantage points, from the vantage point of other human beings, and of course, ultimately, from the vantage point of Hashem. And therefore, the intersection between our hands with which we do things and we master the world, and they are the tools of our creation with which we're now going to do malacha, work on Motzi Shabbos, having finished our Shabbos experience, we take our hands and we remind ourselves, I have skin on my hands, but I also have nails. Every time I look at my hands, this is almost a meditation I'm meant to engage in, and I'm meant to ask myself, am I mastering the world solely through skin, through my own feelings and perspective and experiences, or am I reminding myself I also have nails at the end of my fingers? I can look at things objectively and think about the consequence of what I'm doing from other people's points of view, or from the transcendent point of view of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And therefore the minhag developed that we look at our fingernails through the light, and we engage in that meditation, that reflection at the moment of saying Borei Ma'orei Ha'esh, of making this bracha over fire. So to summarize, from a halachic point of view, we need to use fire at that point. We thank Hashem. It's a bracha not of consumption, according to most opinions, not of bichas and enim. It's a bracha of praise. It's a bracha of praise for human ingenuity, not Shabora that he created light and fire, but that he continues to create multiple fires through us mastering technology. We need to use the light, and to do that, we could look at anything with the light of the Havdalah candle. However, we have the minhag based upon mystical forces to look at our nails, to remind ourselves that these hands are now going to engage in mastery of the world. Make sure we use our hands well. Make sure we always remind ourselves that we don't just have skin, we also have nails. So I'm going to stop there for today. And in Mitzvot Hashem next week, we've used our allotted 45 minutes. Please God, next week we will continue looking at Havdalah and hopefully achieve some insights and understand what Havdalah is about, and also consider it from a halachic perspective, particularly in terms of the role of women. So I will conclude there and wish you all a good day, and look forward to continuing next week. And of course, if there's any questions you want to post in the chat group or to ask me, I'll wait for a couple of minutes. Otherwise, I will conclude